My sister took the company, fired me, and expected tears. I gave her laughter instead. The night she did it, the boardroom smelled like polished wood, stale coffee, and the leftovers of our father's legacy. She thought she was finally rewriting the family story, cutting out the one person who knew how the old script ended. What she did not know, as she slid those papers across the table, was that she had just walked straight into the trap our father built for both of us. And the funniest part was this. He left the instructions with me. Before anyone had titles or corner offices, there was a warehouse that shivered in winter and sweated in July, a cramped office over a loading dock, and a name painted in red letters on the side of trucks that rattled more than they rolled. Caldwell and Daughters Wholesale began as a laughable lie. There were no daughters yet, only a young man called Samuel Caldwell, a borrowed truck, and a stubborn hope that if he wrote the future on enough metal, the future might take the hint. He did not get sons first. Life, with its peculiar sense of balance, sent him a girl, and then another. Later, when a boy arrived, he joked that the logo would finally be accurate. But by then, the words were already famous in their modest way, printed on invoices, stitched on jackets, spoken in the clipped tone of supply managers who had finally found someone who delivered when he said he would. The youngest child, the boy, grew up believing the company name was a promise with his silhouette in it. The middle child, Nadia, grew up recognizing it as a prophecy written without asking her permission. The oldest, Ruth, watched them both and learned early that being firstborn in a family business meant being everyone's practice run. The boy would later be known to bankers and competitors as Adrian Caldwell, but in those early days he was simply the child who knew the difference between the sound of a loaded pallet and an empty one, who could tell by the pitch of the forklift's engine whether the night shift was going smoothly. His homework smelled faintly of cardboard and dust. His childhood soundtrack was the beeping of trucks backing up to the dock, the low murmur of drivers trading stories over cheap coffee. Nadia's childhood was different, even when it happened in the same rooms. Where Adrian saw numbers and routes, she saw patterns and faces. Invoices, to her, were stories about who was growing fast and who was quietly dying. She would stand at the cracked office window and imagine all the shops and cafes that their deliveries fed, the lives built on shelves they never saw. The difference between them was not that one cared and the other did not. It was that they loved different things about the same beast. Their mother Lillian tried to make a home out of a place built to move goods, not feelings. She taped their drawings to the office fridge, squeezed birthday cakes into 20-minute breaks between truck arrivals, and taught them to recognize the ring of their father's laughter in a room full of men trying too hard to sound sure of themselves. In the evenings, in the small house on the edge of the industrial district, she would soak her feet in hot water and say that love was like inventory. You had to count it, not just assume you had enough. Samuel worked and worked and worked. He talked about expansion the way other fathers talked about camping. He wanted a second warehouse, then a third, then proper head office space with a reception desk that did not wobble when someone leaned on it. He wanted to prove that a man with no degree and a habit of saying yes could outlast the ones with suits and graphs. He promised all 3 children that the company was theirs. Not equally, not formally, just with the careless generosity of someone who assumes time will always give him chances to refine his words later. Adrian heard the promise and translated it as duty. Nadia heard it and translated it as possibility. Ruth heard it and, after a few years, quietly stopped translating anything their father said. The first big shift came when Caldwell and Daughters outgrew its square of the city. A new warehouse rose further out, bigger, brighter, with floors that had never known oil stains, with skylights that let in unforgiving daylight. The old office above the dock became storage for things nobody wanted to throw away. The family moved into proper offices with glass walls and conference tables that looked like boats left waiting for a flood. Growth changed everything and also nothing. Samuel still arrived before dawn. He still knew drivers by name, still stopped to help when a pallet toppled, still cursed at malfunctioning printers with the same creative energy he reserved for broken forklifts. But now, beside the battered mugs with company logos, there were binders stamped with words like compliance and audit. People in tailored jackets visited and talked about market share. The business had become respectable enough for people who never touched boxes to feel entitled to opinions. Adrian watched the evolution with a kind of quiet awe. As a teenager, He sat in on meetings and absorbed the language of margins and lead times the way other boys memorize sports statistics. Numbers made sense to him in a way feelings did not. They behaved when you treated them right. They told the truth if you listened long enough. By the time he was in his 20s, he was the unofficial operations brain of Caldwell and Daughters. His father still signed checks and gave speeches, but when the question was how many trucks, which routes, what risk, somebody always turned to Adrian in the end. He did not mind. Being essential was its own reward. Nadia, on the other hand, went away. Not out of rebellion, at least not at first. She was the one who had sat on boxes in the warehouse and drawn new logos, imagining how the brand might look if it did not always smell of diesel. She had been the one to ask, half teasing and half serious, why the company name still pretended Daughters did not run things when in practice they often did. She wanted to learn things the spreadsheets in their office could not tell her. So she studied marketing and strategy, then logistics on a scale that made their humble regional network look like a set of train tracks in a model village. She learned how multinationals talked about supply chains as if they were rivers to be redirected at will. She saw how often they forgot that every river has villages on its banks. She came back with sharper clothes, a new way of holding herself, and a head full of phrases that made their father alternately proud and nervous. Market repositioning, brand refresh, strategic partnerships. She could present a 5-year plan with graphs that rose like hopeful hills into the future. To Samuel, this looked like magic. To Adrian, it looked like risk dressed in expensive fonts. The first real crack between them did not appear in a shouting match. It appeared on a slide in a board meeting where the board still consisted mostly of their father, his accountant, and an uncle who napped with his eyes open. Nadia proposed changing the logo. To her, it symbolized a bigger change underneath, moving from being seen as just another wholesaler to being perceived as a trusted logistics partner. She spoke about perception as if it were cargo that could be loaded into the public imagination. Adrian felt something cave in his chest as he watched their father nod along. That old red script on the side of trucks had carried them through winters when payments were late and fuel prices high. To erase it felt like erasing the years in which they had barely stayed afloat. He did not say that. He talked instead, in careful language, about costs, about the risk of confusing existing clients, about timing. He treated it like a technical disagreement. Nadia treated his caution as personal doubt. It is a particular misfortune of family businesses that every practical decision is shadowed by an old personal argument. Lillian tried to mediate. She reminded them both that the company was big enough to hold their differences if they let it. But something had shifted. For the first time, Nadia felt like a guest in a house she had helped build. For the first time, Adrian felt like a stranger. At his own desk. Their father did what many founders do when faced with the intersecting storms of succession and sibling tension. He postponed. The logo stayed. The trucks kept rolling. Everyone pretended this meant harmony. Time went on. Caldwell and Daughters took on more clients, larger contracts, a new warehouse in another city. The board expanded, reluctantly at first, then with that strange haste that overtakes people when they realize they are not immortal. A lawyer was brought in to draft documents nobody wanted to think about. Shares were issued to the 3 children in careful percentages. Words like succession plan made their way into meetings like unwelcome relatives no one could avoid inviting. The illness did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as a tiredness in Samuel that no one took seriously enough at first. He had always worked like a man who believed fatigue was a personal failing. When he started sitting down more often, people joked that he had finally learned to rest. When he forgot a name here and there, they told stories about age. By the time doctors' phrases like heart function and intervention began to appear, the company was too large for anyone to pretend it would simply pause while its founder lay in a hospital bed. For the first time, the children found themselves alone at the head of the long conference table, the one that had replaced the scratched desk of the old office. The leather chairs seemed too big. The silence before meetings stretched longer. The staff looked at them differently, with a mixture of hope and quiet calculation. Ruth, who had married a man with no patience for family politics, began to recede. She attended the important meetings, signed what needed to be signed, but it was clear to everyone that she did not want the chair. She had treasured stability, not power, and she had seen too closely how that chair bent backs over decades. That left the two who had always believed the story ended with them standing side by side. In theory. In practice, every small decision became a rehearsal for the larger choice nobody wanted to say aloud. Who would be next? Adrian argued for continuity. He knew every supplier's quirks, every driver's strengths, every quiet back door through which the company had survived its leanest years. He could recite the monthly figures from memory, not as abstractions but as weather reports over a landscape he had walked since childhood. Nadia argued for evolution. The world outside was changing faster than the speed at which pallets could be moved. Retail was shifting online, delivery expectations shrinking from days to hours. Caldwell and Daughters, she insisted, could not survive as a proud old workhorse. It needed to become a thoroughbred, sleek and visible. Both believed they were right. Both had evidence. Both loved the company with the intensity of people who had never known a world without its shadow. Their father watched them from his hospital room when he was strong enough. He listened to their reports, argued when he could, and when he could not, he stared at the ceiling as if searching for a version of the future in which love and spreadsheets did not always collide. On one of those days when the machines hummed softly and the nurses had stepped out, he asked Adrian to open the drawer in the bedside table. There were papers in there, an envelope with handwriting that had grown shakier over the years, a pen that had signed hundreds of contracts, and a small object that looked like an old-fashioned key without any door in the world left to fit. He spoke haltingly about trusts and safeguards, about clauses that only mattered under very particular circumstances. He said he had learned, watching other families tear themselves apart over balance sheets, that sometimes the only way to stop a war was to build a wall neither side could move without the other's help. Adrian nodded, the way one does when a sick man speaks in riddles. His mind even then moved toward practicalities. He made a mental note to call the lawyer, to ask for copies, to read whatever needed reading. What he did not realize in that moment was that his father was not giving him a weapon. He was giving him a mirror. Nadia had a separate conversation later, alone by the hospital bed. It was not about clauses or trusts. It was about weight. Her father told her that being in front did not mean being the only light people saw. It meant digesting blame before it reached those who could not bear it. He told her she was brilliant, that the company needed her vision, that she could take them places he had never even imagined. He also told her there was a line between courage and performance, and that the chair she might one day sit in did not exist to impress dinner guests. The problem with deathbed advice is that it often arrives like a puzzle whose pieces fall into place only after the person who designed it has gone. When Samuel Caldwell finally died, the company did not collapse. It did what it had always done. It moved. Trucks rolled. Orders were filled. People still needed the things Caldwell and Daughters carried. But the air in the offices changed. The portrait in the lobby, hastily framed and hung, watched as bankers and consultants came and went. The board convened. Shares were tallied. Opinions, which had once hidden behind Samuel's certainty, stepped forward in fitted suits. On the day of the first formal succession meeting, the conference room felt too bright. Someone had insisted on fresh flowers. Someone else had left a stack of glossy reports on the table, each one containing at least one chart that claimed to predict the future if you were willing to trust its curves. Adrian arrived early, as he always did. He straightened chairs that did not need straightening, checked water jugs that were already full, adjusted the blinds so the light would not catch anyone directly in the eyes. Old habits. The small rituals of a man whose way of caring had always been practical. Nadia arrived exactly on time, as she always had since returning from her years away. She wore a suit that would photograph well, in a color that seemed to have been invented between gray and blue. She carried a folder of her own, thinner than the consultant's reports but, in her mind, far more important. Inside it were notes on positioning, opportunities, threats, all the things her courses had insisted leaders must consider. They greeted each other not as strangers, but not quite as siblings either. There was a polite distance, like a corridor that had once been narrow and full of shared toys and was now carpeted, lined with doors that stayed shut. The board members filtered in. The lawyer set down his laptop with the solemnity of a priest placing a sacred text. The accountant, who had watched them grow from children tugging at their father's sleeves to adults tugging at each other's patience, shuffled papers with an air of someone hoping that this too would somehow sort itself out without anyone bleeding on the balance sheet. Outside in the big yard, a truck pulled out. The driver checked his mirrors and wondered vaguely who would sign his next raise. Inside, the chair at the head of the table remained empty a moment longer. It was not the largest chair physically, but it had a way of making whoever sat in it feel either 3 inches taller or 3 inches smaller, depending on the day. Eventually, the lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak. He talked of process, of votes, of the intention expressed in Samuel's will. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that a number of mechanisms had been put in place to ensure the long-term stability of the company. He did not dwell on them. No one asked. The human heart is very good at ignoring fine print when big emotions are in play. The conversation that followed was, on the surface, civilized. People praised both siblings in the ways people do when they are about to choose between them. They spoke of Adrian's deep knowledge, his steady hand, his history of keeping the company moving smoothly through difficult seasons. They spoke of Nadia's vision, her understanding of the changing market, her ability to speak the language of clients who lived in a world of slides and slogans. What no one said aloud was that the world outside the warehouse gates had begun to value stories more than reliability. In a time when headlines mattered as much as performance, a narrative about a dynamic daughter taking over her late father's company sounded better than one about a quiet son continuing the work. Somewhere between those polite sentences and the ones left unspoken, a decision began to coalesce, the way condensation forms on a cold window. Adrian saw it happening, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the tilt of faces, in the direction of glances, in the way questions were phrased. He understood numbers, patterns of posture were, in the end, just another kind of data. He did not rage. He did not plead. His contribution around the table that day was measured, thoughtful, the way it had always been. He spoke for the company, not for his ego. He convinced himself that this was what made him superior. Nadia, for her part, felt the tide turning in her favor and was ashamed at how much relief it brought. For years she had watched her brother inhabit the operations role with a comfortable authority she had never felt granted. For years she had heard that she was the creative one, the talker, the idea generator, and had been grateful and resentful in equal measure. The possibility of finally being the one in front was both intoxicating and terrifying. The vote, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A show of hands, some nodding, the lawyer recording, the accountant pretending his pen did not shake. No fanfare. No crowning. And yet, in that simple act, the entire architecture of their lives shifted. Nadia Caldwell became the chief executive officer of Caldwell & Daughters Wholesale. The title looked absurdly short on the printed document compared to what it meant in the hidden chambers of hearts and histories. Adrian's new title on paper remained significant. He was still the chief operating officer, still the man who knew how many trucks they could run on a Tuesday in February when 3 of them were in maintenance and 1 driver was on leave. He told himself that real power resided in what kept the lights on, not in the speeches. For a while this arrangement held. In the first weeks, the company did not feel the change as much as the siblings did. Nadia threw herself into external meetings, into calls with major clients who wanted reassurance that this generational change would not cost them their deliveries. She answered with polished confidence, then came home and stared at her ceiling, listening to echoes of her father's warnings about performance and weight. Adrian found himself doing 2 jobs at once, managing the daily chaos of shipments and quietly translating his sister's broad strategic strokes into actions that would not break the system. Sometimes he resented this. Sometimes he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing how indispensable he still was. Around them, the staff adjusted in the way people do when they sense that something fundamental has changed but their own routines have not yet been rewritten. They tested the new CEO with small challenges, small acts of loyalty or resistance. They watched to see if she showed up in the warehouse unannounced, if she learned names, if she understood that the air on the dock in winter was different in every sense from the climate-controlled boardroom. She did, in her own way. But she was also busy learning a new language, that of investors, analysts, banks. The world outside was now watching a story about a daughter inheriting her father's empire. Stories demand drama. Drama demands gestures. It is at this point that some people might expect the first overt act of betrayal, the first sharp conflict, the first slam door. Instead, what came was subtler, less cinematic in the immediate sense, but more dangerous in the long run. A consultant introduced the idea of streamlining leadership. It was presented on slides with tasteful colors and titles about clarity and agility. The message was simple. In a world moving about clarity and agility. The message was simple. In a world moving this fast, the lines of authority needed to be absolutely clear. The existence of powerful siblings in adjacent roles was, the slide implied, a recipe for confusion. The consultant did not say in so many words that the company would be better off with one Caldwell firmly in charge and the other gently moved aside. Her graphs did that work for her. The board listened. Nadia felt a knot in her stomach tighten and then, horrifyingly, begin to feel like resolve. She had spent months being introduced as the new CEO with her brother standing just over her shoulder, never far from the frame. She had heard muttered comments about a double head, about who really ran things. She had smiled through them, laughed them off, stored them like splinters. Now, looking at those slides about clean structures and decisive leadership, she felt an unkind but undeniable thought rise. Perhaps to truly be seen as the leader, she had to stand alone. If her father had been there, he might have stopped the thought from growing. He might have reminded her that standing alone is often just a glamorous phrase for falling with no one to catch you. But he was not there. His portrait in the lobby could not speak. Upstairs, in a file not yet opened, his counterargument waited in the ink of a clause that would not care about feelings when it was finally triggered. Adrian, at that particular moment, knew nothing about the consultant's slides. He was downstairs walking the warehouse with a clipboard he no longer needed, noticing a new driver's nervous habit of checking straps 3 times, the subtle sag in an old rack that would need reinforcing before it became a problem. He felt, as he always did in that space, oddly peaceful. Here, things behaved according to laws he understood. Gravity, wait time. He did not yet know that, in the space of a few meetings he was not invited to, gravity had begun to tilt. The irony, which he would only appreciate much later, was that while his sister sat in a room being told that the company would be stronger if she cut him loose, the very mechanisms that would make such a decision less absolute were already in place because their father had not trusted any of his children, or anyone else, to be wise forever. At the time, Adrian still believed in the old story, that as long as the trucks kept moving and the numbers stayed healthy, family would find a way to coexist. He would remember that belief on the day it shattered, in a boardroom heavy with expectation, when his sister pushed a folder toward him with a hand that trembled just enough to betray everything. He would remember, too, the moment in the hospital when his father had spoken about safeguards and walls, and had pressed into his fingers an envelope he had not opened for months. He did not laugh then. That would come later. For now, as Act 1 draws its long breath, the funny part is still hiding, like a punchline waiting at the bottom of a page. If anyone had told him on that afternoon in the warehouse that his own firing would one day feel less like a fall and more like the release of a trap door for someone else, he would have called it a bad joke. He had yet to learn how often life chooses satire as its favorite genre. Tension never walks into a family business carrying a sign. It arrives disguised as efficiency memos and calendar invites titled Alignment Session. If you want to understand how my sister ended up firing me with a straight face, you have to watch how she boiled me first. The first weeks after the succession had the manic politeness of a wedding reception where the bride and groom secretly hate each other's playlists. Everybody smiled a little too hard. People kept saying exciting times, in the tone usually reserved for incoming storm. Nadia threw herself into her new role, like she was racing against something only she could see. She was everywhere at once, giving quotes to trade magazines, hosting client dinners, filming an internal video where she stood in the warehouse in a high-vis vest that had clearly never known actual dust. In the background of that video, a forklift driver paused, took one look at her pristine boots, and muttered Fashion Week under his breath. The camera didn't catch it. The staff did. Adrian watched all of this with a mixture of pride and unease. He couldn't deny that clients liked seeing her. She photographed well beside pallets, which was not a talent he had ever aspired to. When she spoke about the next chapter of the Caldwell story, investors relaxed. They liked chapters. They already had bookmarks. He tried to be helpful, tried to anticipate what she would need. He sent her summaries of operation bottlenecks, lists of what could actually be changed fast without breaking anything, diagrams explaining why their current scheduling system looked like chaos from above, but was in fact a delicate ecosystem that had evolved through hundreds of near disasters. Sometimes she replied with thoughtful questions. Sometimes she didn't reply at all. When he asked in person if she'd had a chance to look at something, she would say, "It's on my list," with that distracted air people use when they are already drowning in other lists. He told himself that this was normal. New CEOs are supposed to be overwhelmed. He gave her time, which is one of the few things you can't put on a spreadsheet but can absolutely lose. Meanwhile, the consultant's slides continued their quiet work, like termites behind a newly painted wall. Her name was Vanessa. She had that polished, pleasant look that consultants cultivate, the kind that says, "I'm here to improve things, not to blame you, unless of course it turns out to be your fault, in which case please see slide 27. She wasn't evil. She was simply convinced that there was no problem in the world that could not be solved by simplifying an org chart. Over several weeks she held interviews under the noble heading of listening tour. She spoke to dispatchers, to HR, to drivers' representatives. She asked them all the same questions, then filtered their answers through a worldview in which clarity of command ranked just slightly below oxygen on the list of necessities. Just slightly below oxygen on the list of necessities. Again and again, she heard some version of the same thing. "Well, there's Nadia now, of course, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty, you still go to Adrian if you want things actually done right." She wrote this down. She did not hear it as a compliment to both siblings. She heard it as a structural flaw. In her report to the board, this repeated chorus became a bullet point: perceived dual leadership in operations, causing potential for misaligned messaging. The fact that the alignment in question had kept the company from driving itself into a ditch for decades was, to her, an interesting historical note, like a plaque on an old building scheduled for demolition. Nadia read the report in her office late one evening. Outside, the yard was lit by floodlights, the trucks lined up like tired animals waiting for the next order. She rubbed her eyes once, twice. She could hear her father's voice in her head, the one that praised Adrian's steady hand and her own big ideas. She could also hear another voice now, newer, sharper, the whispers she'd caught at conferences, the questions that seemed light on the surface and heavy underneath. "So who really runs things? Is your brother okay sharing the stage? Must be hard, stepping out of his shadow." The report confirmed what her insecurities had already decided. As long as Adrian sat where he sat, she would never be seen as the sole captain. In another world, perhaps, she would have gone to him with that fear in her hands like an offering. Perhaps she would have said, "I need you, but I also need space to be seen. How do we do both?" In another world, he might have answered with humility and humor, and together they might have built a structure that honored both their strengths. But this was not that world. This was one where grief had made them brittle and pride had been mistaken for armor for so long that they could no longer tell the two apart. So instead of confession, there were meetings. The first time the idea of removing Adrian from his role was said out loud, it wasn't even Nadia who said it. They were in a strategy session, one of those long afternoons that smelled of coffee and ambition. Vanessa was presenting her Phase 2 recommendations. The slides were as glossy as ever. Boxes moved. Arrows pointed. Titles shifted places as if they were interchangeable parts in a machine. On slide 14 there it was, two org charts side by side. The current one with both CEO and COO in bold, both surnames Caldwell. And a proposed one with a neat vertical line, CEO at the top, then a row of functional heads beneath, no second Caldwell in sight. "As you can see," Vanessa said, "moving to a single head structure in operations would greatly reduce ambiguity. It would also send a powerful signal to the market about clear leadership." The board members nodded. Consultants have a way of saying, "I want to cut off your arm," in a tone that makes it sound like, "We're thinking of repainting the kitchen." The room interpreted this proposal as a kind of decluttering. One of the external directors, a man who collected directorships the way other people collected vintage wines, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "And what would happen to Adrian under this proposal?" he asked, as if discussing the reassignment of a piece of office furniture. Vanessa smiled, that professional, sympathetic smile that means, "I have already prepared this answer." "Well, there are several options," she said. "He could move into a more advisory role, perhaps focusing on special projects. Or he could transition out over time with a generous package. The important thing is that the new structure reflects a single point of accountability." Single point of accountability. Such a beautiful phrase. Such an efficient way to describe the act of pushing one sibling off a ledge, so that the other's silhouette could be more easily photographed. All eyes shifted subtly toward Nadia. She felt them. She also felt quite palpably the absence at the table. Adrian was not in this meeting, officially because it was about future positioning at the highest level, a phrase that had been carefully chosen to sound like a scope limitation and not like an exclusion. In that moment, Nadia could have said, "No, my brother stays where he is. We find another way to create clarity without sacrificing the man who understands the ground we stand on." She could have insisted that leadership was not a currency to be hoarded, that legitimacy was not born from the absence of competition but from presence in crisis. Instead, she heard herself ask, how would this be communicated internally? It was a small question on the surface, a detail, but everyone in the room heard the larger one echoed underneath. If I do this, how do I avoid being the villain in the story? Vanessa slid into that gap like water. With the right framing, she said smoothly, this can be positioned as a natural evolution. Adrian has been carrying a heavy load for many years. We can speak in terms of him stepping back, focusing on life outside the business, trusting the next generation. It doesn't have to be seen as removal. The words next generation hit Nadia like both a compliment and a curse. She was technically the same generation as Adrian, but she knew what Vanessa meant. The phrase translated to the one we can present as new, which in turn translated to you. The board continued to discuss timelines, legalities, packages. They talked about her brother as if he were a line item. It made Nadia nauseous. It also made her feel, to her own shame, powerful. By the end of the meeting, no formal decision had been made. There were phrases like, we should explore this, and let's ask HR to model the scenarios. Nobody voted. Nobody signed. And yet, when they stood up, something in the air had shifted further. The slow boiling had turned to a simmer. Downstairs in operations, Adrian was solving a crisis involving a shipment of medical supplies that had been rerouted twice by a glitch in the new software. He was on the phone with a driver named Mo, talking him through back roads that didn't show on maps, fingers tracing unseen routes on the surface of his desk. Trust me, he said. Take the left after the old sugar factory. The bridge looks like it's about to give up, but it's stronger than it looks. You'll save 20 minutes. Mo laughed. I always trust you, boss. GPS talks big, but you actually know the road. When they hung up, the problem felt small in the context of what was brewing upstairs. But Adrian did not yet know that his knowledge of every left turn and weak bridge would soon be described in a document as valuable historical memory that can be leveraged in a transition. The first clue that something was wrong arrived not as a blow, but as a missing calendar invite. Every Monday, there was a standing meeting between CEO and COO. It had been in their schedules since the succession was formalized. Ostensibly, it was a space to align on priorities, to ensure that what Nadia promised to the world could actually be delivered by the trucks. One Monday, Adrian noticed that the invite was no longer there. He assumed at first that it was a technical glitch. Calendars get hungry, they eat events sometimes. He went to Nadia's office at the usual time, knocked on the frosted glass. Come in, she called. He stepped inside and found her with Vanessa and two board members, hunched over a laptop. The air felt like it did outside exam halls. Oh, he said. I didn't realize you were meeting. She glanced at her screen, then at him. Something flickered across her face, a flash of guilt, quickly smoothed over. We rescheduled the Monday check-ins, she said. I thought my assistant had updated you. Sorry, Adrian. This one's just some strategic follow-up with the board. He nodded, stepped back, told himself it was nothing. Schedules change. People get busy. He had plenty to do downstairs. As he walked away, one of the board members closed the door with just a little too much care, the way people do when they know they're excluding someone and want to convince themselves it's about noise, not loyalty. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Meetings Adrian would once have considered essential to his role floated into an atmosphere just above his reach. He'd hear about decisions after the fact, through carefully worded emails that began with, as you know, when in fact, he did not. He adjusted. He told himself this was what delegation looked like. He focused on the work that remained firmly in his hands, the daily ballet of trucks and pallets and staff. If certain spreadsheets were now sent to Nadia directly, If certain client calls went straight to her, that was, he reasoned, appropriate. She was the CEO. Visibility mattered. Then HR requested a meeting to discuss his long-term plans. HR never wants to discuss your long-term plans because they worry about your happiness. HR wants to know if you are about to become a problem they have to file. He found himself in a small room with soft chairs and neutral artwork, the universal decor of difficult conversations. The HR director, a woman named Elise who had been with the company almost as long as he had, smiled at him in a way that made his stomach drop. "We've been thinking," she began, "about how much you've given to Caldwell and Daughters over the years." The word given was the first red flag. The second was the way she clutched her notebook like a shield. She spoke of sacrifice, of dedication, of the toll leadership takes. She asked if he had ever imagined what it might be like to step back a little, to have more time for himself, for she cleared her throat. Life outside of these walls. He stared at her. "My life," he said slowly, "has been built inside these walls." She nodded sympathetically, which somehow made it worse. "That's exactly why we're having this conversation proactively, she said. "We want to make sure that, as the company evolves, your next chapter is one that feels intentional. Not something that just happens to you." He almost laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the script was so absurdly transparent. They were trying to convince him that stepping aside would be a self-care choice. That being edged out of the cockpit was a spa day. "Is this about the org review?" he asked. Elise hesitated just long enough to answer him without answering. "We're looking at a number of structural changes to support Nadia's vision," she said. "Your role is central, which is exactly why we want to engage you early in thinking about potential transitions over the next few years." He left the room with a folder full of phrases like phase timeline and executive coaching for life after leadership. The words clattered around in his mind like loose screws. At home that night, he sat at his kitchen table with the folder in front of him. He did not open it. Instead, he opened the drawer where he kept things he didn't know what to do with. Old keys, a broken watch, a postcard from a driver who had retired to Spain, and the envelope his father had given him in the hospital. He had read the contents after the funeral briefly, in the exhausted fog of grief and logistics. He had understood, in theory, what the founder's safeguard clause meant. But he had filed it under nuclear options, alongside selling the company and faking your own death. Now, as HR cheerful languaged him toward the exit, he took the papers out again. The clause was stark, almost ugly in its clarity. If any direct descendant actively employed in an executive capacity were to be removed from that role without documented cause, misconduct, fraud, gross negligence, the founder's shares would immediately transfer into a trust. The trustee Adrian. The purpose, to prevent any one person, under temporary emotion or pressure, from steering the company into a decision that might destroy its foundations. At the bottom of the document, in the margin, his father had scribbled a note. "This is not a gift. It's a seatbelt. Don't wear it like a crown." Adrian had laughed at that line the first time he'd read it. Now it did not feel funny. It felt like a hand reaching out of the past to tap him on the forehead. There was an irony here, one he could appreciate even through the sting of betrayal. His sister and her consultant were trying to remove him in the name of streamlining. In doing so, they were preparing to trip over the very safeguard their father had installed to stop exactly this sort of family drama from wrecking the larger machine. He sat back, looked at the ceiling, and for the first time since Samuel's death, spoke aloud to the empty room. "Did you know?" he asked the air. "Did you really think it would come to this? Or did you just not trust any of us?" Silence answered as it usually does. He could, at this point, have marched into Nadia's office, thrown the documents on her desk, and demanded an explanation. He could have warned her, could have given her a chance to stop the train before it hit the claws. Instead, he did nothing. Not out of malice. Out of curiosity. He wanted to see how far she would go. He wanted to know whether this was a momentary wobble, a burst of insecurity, or a deliberate rewriting of the family script in which he was cast as the tired old chapter to be skipped. In the weeks that followed, the temperature continued to rise. He was excluded from more meetings. His budget proposals were deferred, pending strategic alignment. A project he had championed for years, a training program for drivers that would finally formalize and reward the knowledge they accumulated on the road, was shelved with a bland note from finance, not a priority this quarter. Then came the email. Subject line: Board Meeting Agenda Strategic Realignment Proposals. His name appeared twice in the attached document. Once under Key Stakeholders Impacted. Once more chillingly under Roles to be Redesigned. He read the section carefully. The language was exquisite in its evasiveness. In line with our goal of creating a lean, agile leadership structure, we propose consolidating operational oversight under the CEO, with functional managers reporting directly. This change recognizes the significant contributions of the current COO, while acknowledging the need for a new leadership model, as Caldwell and Daughters evolves into its next phase. Translation: We're going to cut your job, put your responsibilities into a hat, and hope the person at the top can juggle. There it was, in black and white on the official agenda. They were no longer just thinking about boiling him. They had set a date to check whether he was done. Adrian closed the laptop. It was at this point that the story could have turned dour, heavy, a tragedy about betrayal and stubbornness. And yes, it hurt. Yes, he felt the slow crush of humiliation. Yes, he spent more than one night staring at his ceiling, wondering if he had mistaken stability for complacency, if he had failed to fight early enough. But somewhere under the weight, another feeling began to grow, quiet and strange. Amusement. Because the more he saw the plan spelled out, the more ridiculous it became. The consultant jargon, the careful euphemisms, the assumption that he would go along with this transition, as if he had no say in it, as if his name were a removable sticker on a door. He thought of the clause again, of the trust, of the fact that on the day they officially voted him out of his role without cause, an automatic legal mechanism would flip a switch and move the founder's controlling shares into his custodianship. In effect, the act of firing him would make him, on paper, the single most powerful individual in the company. Not in title, in votes. He did not want that. He did not want to be a shadow king. The very idea exhausted him. But the absurdity of the situation began to glow with a dark, compelling humor. His sister, desperate to prove she could stand without him, was about to set herself on a legal trapdoor built long before either of them knew what the words "oh" really cost. And she had no idea. Tension at that point did something unexpected. It smiled. On the morning of the board meeting, the sky over the warehouse yard was gray, the kind of neutral weather that refuses to take sides. Drivers moved in their routines, coffee in one hand, paperwork in the other. Forklifts beeped, reversing as they had reversed 1,000 times, unaware that upstairs the lines on the org chart were about to be redrawn. Adrian dressed as he always did for board days. Tie slightly too plain, suit a little older than the fashion cycle recommended, shoes polished out of habit rather than vanity. He slipped the trust documents into his briefcase, not because he intended to reveal them, but for the same reason people carry umbrellas on days when the forecast says unlikely showers. He walked through the building, nodding to staff, pausing to answer a question about a delayed shipment, to sign off on an overtime request. His hands moved over the familiar surfaces of his world, door handles, railings, the back of chairs, as if recording their texture one last time. In the lobby, he passed his father's portrait. It had been moved slightly since the funeral, adjusted to better suit the sightlines of visitors. The old man in the frame looked out at the space with the mild surprise of someone who had not really expected to become decor. Adrian paused. "Well," he murmured, "this is going to be something." The portrait did not answer. But if oil paint could smirk, perhaps it might have. Upstairs, the boardroom awaited. Polished wood, the faint smell of citrus cleaner. The long table laid out with stacks of agendas, glasses of water reflecting the overhead lights. People took their seats with the practiced choreography of those who are used to sitting in judgment. Nadia sat at the head of the table, a pen aligned perfectly with the edge of her notepad. She looked composed, controlled. Only someone who had known her for decades would see the tiny signs. The way her left foot tapped twice just before each meeting began, the way her fingers gripped the pen a millimeter too tightly. When Adrian entered, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that brief exchange, 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. Childhood mornings in the old warehouse. Teenage arguments about who got to ride with their father on big deliveries. Late nights as adults arguing quietly about expansion, about risk, about the future. He took his seat halfway down the table. The agenda in front of him bore his name like a patience chart. The chair of the board cleared his throat. The meeting began. Financials first. They always come first, like the appetizer no one wants to admit they care most about. Revenue up in some segments, down in others. Costs rising, fuel a constant headache. They discussed, they nodded, they reassured themselves that the numbers at least still obeyed. Then came strategy. Slides were shown. Nadia spoke about market shifts, about competitors, about e-commerce clients demanding tighter windows. She was good. Adrian could admit that. She had learned to weave story and data together in a way that held the room. He watched the directors lean in, caught up in her description of a future where Caldwell and Daughters was no longer just a regional player, but a recognized name in logistics nationwide. And then, inevitably, came the last section on the agenda. Executive structure. Proposed realignment. The air felt thicker, as if someone had turned down the oxygen slightly. Nadia's voice did not waver as she introduced the topic. Vanessa took over for the details. The slide appeared. The two org charts, current and proposed. The language was the same as in the email. Now read aloud as if repetition could alchemize corporate euphemism into truth. Adrian listened. He watched. He observed his own name moving from a central box to a smaller one in the corner labeled Senior Advisor, Transition Role. It was almost artful, how they'd shrunk him without erasing him entirely. A ghost with a business card. They spoke of honoring his contribution, of giving him space, of making room for new talent. The phrases piled up like packing material around a fragile object everyone pretended was not already cracked. When they finally stopped talking, everyone looked at him. The chairman cleared his throat again. Adrian, he said gently, we'd appreciate hearing your thoughts. It was perhaps the first truly honest request of the day. He took a breath. The kind you take before a plunge or a confession or a punchline. And somewhere quietly, the part of him that had begun to see the comedy in all of this stepped forward. Because if you think about it, there is something undeniably funny about a group of intelligent adults carefully staging an execution while standing directly over a trapdoor they do not know exists. What he would say next and what would happen after belonged to another act. For now the pot had finally reached boiling. And the man in it was starting unexpectedly to smile. The thing about a boardroom is that it amplifies silence. Not the friendly kind, no, the clinical, steel-edged silence that wraps around a man when everyone is waiting to see how he'll react to being pushed off a cliff. Adrian looked around the table, not as a victim, but as a man quietly taking inventory of who had already dug the hole, and who was still pretending to hold the shovel for moral support. Nadia's pen was poised just above her notepad, the way a duelist holds a sword before deciding where to strike. Vanessa had that serene consulting expression, half, I'm here to help, half, I've already billed you for this. The chairman repeated himself. Adrian, your thoughts. He didn't speak right away. He let the question hang, like a fragile ornament suspended over a hard floor. Let them lean in. Let the oxygen thin slightly around their expectations. He remembered something his father used to say while tightening bolts on old machinery. If people are determined to break the thing, let them. But make sure they understand exactly what they're touching. So he began gently. I think, he said, folding his hands, that an org chart can tell you many things. It can describe control, vision, ambition. He paused. But it can't tell you history, or weather, or what actually happens in the dark when a truck goes off route in a thunderstorm. The directors exchanged glances, some bored, some defensive, some suddenly aware that philosophy was not what they had signed up for. He continued, voice steady. I think leadership is a peculiar thing. Sometimes it's visible. Sometimes it looks like glossy slides about agility. His gaze flicked toward Vanessa. Other times it looks like someone getting a 2 a.m. call about a broken axle and driving out with a wrench before the shipment collapses. Vanessa stiffened. Nadia stared at him, unreadable. I also think, he added, that clarity is important. You're right about that. A business needs a single direction. The chairman nodded as though the victory were already halfway in his pocket. And so, Adrian said softly, if the board truly believes that the company is stronger with me out of my role, I'll accept that. Gasps would have been too dramatic. But the subtle shifts, chairs adjusting, eyebrows lifting, pens pausing midair, were enough to prove that everyone had expected a fight, not surrender. Nadia's lips parted in surprise. It was the first genuine expression she'd allowed herself in weeks. However, Adrian said, and now the softness thickened into something else, something with hinge with teeth. Before I accept the restructuring, I only want one thing. The chairman leaned forward. Of course. We can discuss packages. No, Adrian said. I want the board to confirm on record that this removal is not due to misconduct, or fraud, or negligence. It was such a reasonable request. Innocent even. Only someone paying microscopic attention might have seen the spark behind his eyes. The lawyer looked up sharply. He had read every clause in the founder's documents. The fine print. The trapdoors. The landmines. His face went pale in a way that only people who fear paperwork more than death can truly achieve. The chairman frowned. Naturally. This isn't punitive. Good, Adrian said quietly. Then please state that clearly in the minutes. I'd like the language precise. A cold draft slid through the room. Not from the vents, this was the draft that comes when someone realizes they've stepped onto a staircase without checking whether all the steps are still there. The lawyer cleared his throat. Perhaps we should. We should proceed, Nadia interrupted, her voice firm, though the tremor beneath it betrayed something cracking. This isn't personal. For the first time in weeks, Adrian smiled at her. A small, almost fond smile. I know it isn't. The chairman motioned to the secretary. Fine. Please record that the proposed removal is not based on any performance or disciplinary concerns. Click. The keys captured the sentence. One harmless line. One mild phrase. One nail hammered into a hidden mechanism. Adrian exhaled slowly. It sounded like relief, but Nadia, if she had been listening properly, might have caught the faint humor in it. The beginning of a laugh waiting for the right moment to surface. The chairman straightened. In that case, all that remains is the vote. And then it happened. Hands rose. They were steering the company toward a cleaner, lighter future. A future with one Caldwell instead of two. A future in which the heir could finally stretch her wings without the shadow of her brother across the table. Vanessa smiled as if watching a surgery she'd recommended go smoothly. The board members nodded, certain they'd done something modern and bold. The chairman tapped his pen, counting the raised hands. Majority. Passed. Adrian Caldwell was removed as COO. Nadia let out a slow, quiet breath, relief, fear, triumph, all mixed into a cocktail only siblings could understand. She looked at him again, as if searching for the fury she expected. The wounded pride. The explosion. Instead, he simply nodded. Thank you for the clarity, he said. There it was again, that faint, impossible-to-place smile. Not mocking. Not angry. Something else. Something that made Vanessa glance at the lawyer, and the lawyer glance at the agenda, and the board glance at each other with an unease too small to articulate. The meeting ended. Chairs scraped. Papers rustled. People shook hands with the careful solemnity reserved for funerals and promotions. Adrian didn't rush. He gathered his things with the slow precision of someone packing away a life. His briefcase clicked shut like a book closing on a chapter nobody expected to end that day. The directors began filtering out, their voices low, their expressions proud in the way people are proud when they believe they've made a rational decision in a chaotic world. Nadia stayed seated. When the room finally emptied, she looked at him across the vast table, the same table where they had once drawn routes on napkins, where they had argued about logos, where their father had lectured and laughed and threatened to retire every other month. I didn't want it to be ugly, she said softly. It isn't, he replied. It's just business. She swallowed. You're not angry. I'm many things, he said. On the list today. She stared at him confused. Suspicious. Human. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to do this. Oh, he said gently, picking up his coat. I already do. Her brow furrowed. You do. Yes, he said, turning toward the door. And someday you will too. It was the way he said it. Not threatening. Not triumphant. Just a strange, knowing calm. A calm made of old documents. Of margin notes. Of fine print waiting like a sleeper agent. She watched him leave the boardroom without looking back. And for the first time since becoming CEO, Nadia Caldwell felt something she hadn't felt before. Not guilt. Not victory. Not fear. Something worse. Crack. A hairline fracture in the story she had been telling herself. A quiet, creeping suspicion that her brother's acceptance had not been defeat, but preparation. But she pushed it aside. Board politics. Emotional residue. Nothing more. She didn't know not yet that the document her father wrote, the one he called a seatbelt, had just snapped into place with the gentle click of a latch. Her victory wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of the fall. And upstairs just outside the boardroom, Adrian finally let out the softest, quietest laugh. The kind only someone who sees the punchline early can afford. There are moments in life when the world doesn't end, it just tilts a few degrees, quietly like a painting slipping on a wall. Not enough to fall. Just enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable without knowing why. That's what happened after the firing. In the official minutes it was labeled, a seamless leadership transition. In the unofficial memory of everyone present, it was the moment the air in the building changed temperature. Adrian left the boardroom with the collected calm of a man walking away from a fire he had personally installed sprinklers for. The board, meanwhile, relieved but unsure whether they'd actually passed. Nadia stayed in that chair for a long moment after he walked out. Her pen lay still on the notepad. Her breath returned in small, uneven steps. She had expected tears. She had expected slammed doors. She had expected the version of her brother she feared, furious, betrayed, loud. She did not expect quiet, or that strange, unsettling smile, or the way he seemed to walk away lighter than when he'd arrived. Something about that bothered her deeply. But leadership, she told herself, cannot pause for reflection. She gathered her things, steadied her spine the way her father had taught her, and marched downstairs to deliver the updated organizational direction to the executive team. Because what's the point of winning the throne if you don't sit on it immediately? HR had prepared a statement so polished you could see your reflection in every sentence. Words like mutual decision, strategic evolution, and next chapter floated across the page like smug little balloons. Nadia read it aloud to the executive team in a meeting room where the walls were lined with old photographs of her father shaking hands with people who had never needed an org chart to trust him. The room listened. Silent. Still. When she finished, a man named Boyd, head of fleet operations for 20 years, the same man who taught Adrian how to tell by engine sound whether a truck was lying about its health, spoke first. So, Adrian's gone. Not gone, she corrected. Transitioning into an advisory role. Boyd blinked. Meaning what it says. He gave a slow nod, the kind given by a man mentally packing up his understanding of the universe and folding it into a smaller, less comfortable box. Across the table someone shifted. A quiet ripple of discomfort traveled around the room, subtle but unmistakable. They weren't resisting. They were recalibrating. Trying to imagine a world where the person they had always gone to when something broke was suddenly a non-operational resource. Nadia felt it, and hated that she felt it. But she delivered the script. She kept her voice steady. She repeated the talking points. That's what new CEOs do when someone higher on the ladder expects confidence. They pretend they invented it. Still, she caught a few looks in the room, those faint, fleeting glances between people who shared the same unspoken thought. How long until the wheels come off? While upstairs she reinforced her new role, downstairs something else was happening. Drivers, dispatchers, and warehouse staff had heard immediately, because bad news moves through concrete walls faster than forklifts. They were gathered in knots of 3 or 4, coffee cups in hand, speaking in the half-coded language of working-class truth. He's out, someone muttered. Out, another asked. Fired, declared a third. With the confidence of someone who had pieced the story together from overheard fragments. The opinions were varied. Man knew this place better than he knew his own house. Who's running ops now? No one asked US. She's got guts, firing her own brother. She'd better hope those guts come with a GPS. And yet, amid all the reactions, the most notable thing was this. No one said Adrian deserved it. Not one person. That alone set the stage for something Nadia had underestimated. The loyalty her brother had earned quietly, slowly, without ever being the person in front of the camera. By day 2, Nadia began to feel a shift. First it was tiny. A delayed report here. A missing update there. Managers needing clarification on decisions that had once been intuitive. She brushed it off. Growing pains. Nothing more. By day 4, the tiny disruptions formed a pattern. Trucks scheduled under her new streamlined reporting structure left later than usual. One distribution partner called with concerns about miscommunication. Another, politely, cautiously, asked if Adrian was still reachable, just for some clarification. Each time she forced a smile. "We're in a transition period," she said. "All under control." Her voice sounded rehearsed, even to herself. Then came Friday afternoon. A client, one of their oldest, a chain of regional pharmacies, sent a pointed message. "We'd like to request Adrian on our next coordination call. His knowledge of our routes is unmatched." It wasn't a criticism. It wasn't even rude. But it landed like a jab straight to the ribcage. Because beneath the polite wording was an unspoken truth. Your leadership is new. His competence is old. We trust him. We don't know about you yet. Nadia deleted the email draft she'd written 3 times before sending a clipped response. "Adrian is no longer responsible for operations. I will handle the call." She pressed send. Then stared at the screen, jaw tight, as if she could will the world to adopt her authority faster. He went home after the firing, closed the door behind him, loosened his tie, and laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a quiet, disbelief-tinged chuckle, the sound of someone who sees the full map while everyone else studies a corner of it. Then he opened the binder. The trust documents. The founder's shares. The clause his father had called a seatbelt, but had unintentionally turned into something closer to a parachute. He reread the rules. His removal without cause, now documented in the minutes, activated the trust. The trust placed the founder's controlling shares into his custodianship. Those shares gave him overriding voting power. In other words, the moment the board fired him, they handed him the keys. They thought they'd locked him out. They had locked the door with him on the inside. It was the kind of twist that would have made his father snort with approval. "Always check the fine print," Adrian murmured. Then he sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the faintest smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He didn't want revenge. Well, not the dramatic scorched earth kind. No, Adrian preferred something cleaner, something patient, something poetic, something that let people reveal themselves fully so that the consequences, when they arrived, felt like natural endings rather than punishments. And so he waited. He didn't call anyone, didn't rush to unveil the clause, didn't barge into the next board meeting with the paper raised triumphantly. He let the board run their victory lap. Let his sister enjoy her throne. Let the consultants revise the org chart with trembling excitement. He waited for the moment when the illusion of control began to slip. Nadia didn't notice the shift at first. Power has a way of cushioning a person from the tremors beneath their own feet. She walked into the office each morning with the posture of someone who believed she had finally stepped into her rightful place. Her team greeted her with polite enthusiasm. Investors answered her emails faster. The press seemed intrigued by the next-generation leadership story. On the surface, everything looked exactly the way she wanted. Clean, elevated, modern. But underneath, something small and sharp began to move. It began with a missing signature. A routine vendor contract needed renewal, a contract Adrian had managed for 15 years with a handshake and a 10-minute call. Now it sat in her inbox half completed, flagged by legal. "The terms have shifted slightly," the lawyer explained. "We need board approval due to the volume threshold." "Board approval?" she repeated, surprised. "Since when?" "It's in the founder's guidelines," he said with a caution she didn't quite catch. "It's rarely been triggered." She brushed it off, told them to schedule a vote. Easy. Another box checked on the CEO came the directors split. Not dramatically, not rebelliously, just unevenly. A few abstained. A couple said they needed more context. The chairman frowned as if revisiting a puzzle with a missing piece. It was a small delay, the kind you could ignore. But it was the first pebble loosening from the mountain. The second sign arrived disguised as a compliment. At a logistics conference, after her polished presentation about Caldwell and Daughters entering a bold new era, a seasoned competitor approached her. Impressive talk, he said. But tell me, how's your brother? Her smile froze. He's well. He's transitioning roles. Ah, the man said knowingly, with the familiarity of having watched 100 family businesses implode in slow motion. Always tricky when a founder's favorite steps aside. People often forget where the real levers are. She laughed politely, but the comment lodged itself in her ribs like a splinter she couldn't reach. The founder's favorite. The real levers. Why did that annoy her so deeply? Because she didn't want to be her father's favorite. She wanted to be his legacy, but legacy is built on foundations. And foundations have a funny way of revealing cracks only when weight is applied. By week 3 the cracks formed lines. A distribution partner who had always renewed year after year suddenly wanted to pause negotiations. A fleet manager emailed her about a route change Adrian had always handled personally. A supplier who'd never caused trouble sent a curt message reminding the company of penalties for late payments, a payment Adrian had already scheduled before being pushed out. Nadia spent hours sorting through these tiny, irritating fires. She didn't see them as symptoms of a larger problem. She saw them as inefficiencies, remnants of an old system she was determined to modernize. What she didn't notice was how often someone would say, "Adrian used to manage that. Adrian always knew the timing. Adrian would have had that solved already." She brushed each comment aside, but they accumulated in her mind like dust in corners she pretended not to see. Still, her pride stayed intact. For now. Meanwhile, Adrian lived a life so calm it looked suspicious to people who knew him. He woke slowly, ate breakfast without urgency, took long walks, visited the warehouse once quietly after hours, standing among the pallets as if greeting old, loyal friends. He didn't meddle. He didn't sabotage. He didn't gossip. He simply waited, patiently, methodically, almost cheerfully, for the mechanism his father built to complete its work. The trust documents sat on his kitchen table like a sleeping lion. All they needed was the board's filing of his removal. A bureaucratic step scheduled for the end of the month. Once filed, the founder's shares would shift into his custodianship. Not ownership, custodianship. A guardian role. Protective. Restrictive. Powerful. It was not revenge. It was architecture. Adrian didn't need to lift a finger. He only needed gravity to work the way gravity always does. The third sign came one morning when Nadia walked into her office and saw her assistant standing stiffly, like someone delivering bad news to a queen. "You have an email," the assistant said carefully. "From the auditors." Auditors. Not a word you want before coffee. Nadia's stomach tightened as she opened the message. No scandal. No disaster. Just a request. A simple line item needed validation. A line item requiring access to a restricted governance file associated with founder-level shares. "I can't access this," she muttered. "That's strange," the assistant said. "Shouldn't the CEO have access to everything?" She should. Yes, she absolutely should. But when she clicked the link, a message appeared. Custodian authorization. Her breath caught. Trust custodian? Who was the custodian? Her mother? A lawyer? Some outside advisor? She scrolled, clicked, checked the internal registry, and then the bottom of her stomach dropped. Custodian, Adrian Samuel Caldwell. She stared at the name for a long, stunned moment. Her father's handwriting flashed in her memory. His tired voice in the hospital. His riddles. His warnings. She felt the edges of a panic she didn't dare name. Why would he make Adrian custodian of anything? Why would founder-level shares need a custodian at all? Why wasn't she recorded as the primary authority? Why? "No," she said aloud. "No. There must be a mistake." But mistakes don't appear in legal registries. Mistakes don't come with activation dates. Mistakes don't smile calmly in boardrooms after being fired. She reread the email. Her pulse thumped in her ears. Activation triggered upon executive removal without cause. No. No. She hadn't. She didn't. But she had. Publicly. Unanimously. Officially. And the minutes reflected it clearly. Removal not based on any misconduct or negligence. The phrase Adrian had insisted on. The phrase she had agreed to. The phrase she thought was harmless. She felt the slap of realization like a cold wind. She hadn't fired her brother. She had activated him, not as CEO, not as advisor, but as the legal guardian of the founders controlling shares. Power. Quiet, overwhelming structural power. Her entire succession, her entire new reign, was balanced on top of a clause she hadn't known existed. Now she knew, and knowing changed everything. Her knees felt weak as she closed the tab. The office suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too exposed. A single thought formed. Modest kitchen. Adrian folded a newspaper, sipped his coffee, and smiled. Not with malice, but with the calm of a man who understands timing. He didn't want to destroy his sister. He just wanted her to feel the floor beneath her feet, for the first time in her life. And whether she was ready or not, the floor had already started to shift. The human heart doesn't break in a single moment. It fractures first, thin, invisible, almost polite, before the real shattering begins. And for Nadia, the fracture wasn't the firing or the board vote, or even the consultant's carefully engineered chessboard. It was the email. The one with her brother's name stamped across the trust registry like a verdict she didn't see coming. For a few minutes she simply sat there, staring at the screen as if it might blink and rewrite itself. It didn't. Legal documents don't correct themselves out of mercy. They wait. They sit still and quiet until the person reading them realizes the cost of their own ignorance. She swallowed hard and forced herself to breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The meditation trick her therapist had taught her years ago. But no breathing exercise prepares you for discovering that the man you just fired is the only person in the entire company who outranks you on paper. She opened the document again, hoping she'd misread a date, a clause, a signature. No luck. Every line stared back at her with the unwavering confidence of ink that knew exactly what it was doing. Founder. Samuel Caldwell. Trust custodian. Adrian Samuel Caldwell. Activation condition. Executive removal without cause. Voting rights. Full custodial authority. Duration. Until succession stability is deemed secure. Stable succession. She let out a bitter laugh. Stability had left the building the second she raised her hand against her brother. Her phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. Check in. We should finalize the leadership messaging. She stared at the message, stunned by the ordinariness of it. Messaging. Brand alignment? Signal to the market? The market had nothing to do with the earthquake currently splitting open under her seat. For the first time since becoming CEO, she didn't respond. She placed the phone face down, as if turning it away would soften the truth. She needed answers. But who to ask? Not the board. They had already proved they were quicker to trust a consultant's slide deck than decades of shared work between siblings. Not the lawyers. They would treat it like an academic puzzle, far removed from the emotional carnage. Not her assistant. She'd panic. There was only one person who could explain what this was, where it came from, why her father had written a clause like this, and what it meant for her leadership. The very person she least wanted to face. Her brother. She stood, legs slightly unsteady, and walked out of her office with the measured grace of someone performing normalcy for an audience that didn't know they were watching. The hallway felt longer than usual. Her heels clicked against the floor with a hollow, echoing rhythm. Every step seemed to whisper the same humiliating truth. You didn't just push him out. You pushed him up. She found him where she should have known he would be. Not at home, not out celebrating freedom, not nursing wounds, but in the one place that had always grounded him. The warehouse. He was standing near the loading bay, hands in his pockets, watching a forklift maneuver between stacks of shrink-wrapped pallets. It looked almost like meditation. The symphony of engines, beeps, footsteps. This was his real boardroom, the place where he never had to prove anything. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure how to approach him. He didn't look back, but he spoke first, as if he had always known she would come. Rough morning. His tone was gentle. Too gentle. It stung more than anger would have. She stepped forward. Drivers passed her with nods, respectful, neutral, careful. They didn't see a CEO walking in. They saw someone stripped of her invisible crown. Can we talk? She said. He turned to face her. His expression was calm. Not smug. Not wounded. Just patient. Of course, he said. She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for days. I found something, she said, keeping her voice low. In the founder's guidelines. Something about shares. Control. A trust. His eyebrow lifted slightly, as if amused at how long it took her to get here. Yes, he said. Our father's safety net. For you, she said softly. He shrugged. For the company. She swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. It wasn't bitterness toward him. It was toward the ghost of a man who somehow understood their flaws better than they did. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. I assumed you knew, he said. But when the HR director started hinting at transitions, and when the board meeting agenda came out, and when you insisted they document that my removal wasn't due to misconduct. He paused, giving her a chance to connect the dots. She did. Painfully. You knew I was triggering it, she murmured. I suspected, he corrected gently. But I didn't want to interfere. I wanted you to make your choices freely. She flinched. That wording, your choices, cut deeper than any accusation. So what now? She asked. And there it was, the question she had never imagined she would ask her younger brother. The question that trembled with vulnerability. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his eyes softened. That depends, he said. What do you want to happen? She almost laughed. What she wanted. She wanted the clock to reverse 3 weeks. She wanted her father alive to explain this. She wanted a different version of her sermons. But none of that was on the table. I want to lead, she said. But not like this. He nodded. I know. And you can. She blinked, surprised. You're not going to use the clause? She asked quietly. He sighed. Of course not. I don't want control. Then with a wry smile. You gave it to me by accident. I didn't earn it. Her cheeks warmed with shame. But, he continued, I also can't ignore the trust. Or break a clause Dad wrote. That man built entire fortresses out of words. So what happens? She asked. I hold the shares, he said. But only until succession stabilizes. Which means. She finished the sentence for him. Which means I need to prove I deserve the chair. Exactly. Not through board votes. Not through consultants. Not through firing threats or org charts. Through competence. Through clarity. Through leadership that wasn't afraid of shadows. She stared at him, the sibling she had pushed aside, the one she thought she needed to eclipse in order to shine. And she realized something humbling. He wasn't her enemy, he was her ballast. Her mirror. Her missing piece. Adrian, she whispered. I'm sorry. He nodded gently. I know. The apology didn't magically fix anything. But it cracked the surface. This time in a way that let light in instead of letting everything fall apart. A forklift beeped nearby. A driver shouted directions. Life went on. Adrian took a step toward her. Let's steady the company together, he said. Not as CEO and former COO. As Caldwell's. Her throat tightened. Yes, she whispered. Let's. For the first time in months. For the first time since their father's portrait was hung in the lobby. For the first time since insecurity began whispering in her ear. She didn't feel like she was leading alone. Linger. Samuel Caldwell would have approved. Momentum is a strange thing. One moment it's dragging you downhill with the weight of your own mistakes, and the next it's lifting you, slowly, steadily, toward the place you should have been standing all along. After Nadia's apology in the warehouse, something shifted between the siblings. Not a miracle, not an instant reconciliation, but a slow turning of gears that had been jammed for years. They didn't leave the warehouse together. That would have looked too sentimental, too cinematic. Instead, Adrian gave her a small nod before walking toward the far exit, and she lingered, staring at the forklift aisles as if the truth of her life had always been spelled out in stacks of pallets she never bothered to study. When she finally returned to her office, she felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter from the honesty, heavier from the responsibility that honesty demanded. The city outside her window looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because she had finally stopped pretending she was alone at the helm. She sat at her desk and opened a blank document. For the first time since becoming CEO, she wasn't writing a presentation or a memo or a strategy outline meant to impress outsiders. She was writing a plan built on humility instead of theater. At the top, she typed a simple sentence. Stability begins with truth. Then she wrote what she could handle, what she couldn't, what she needed to learn from Adrian, What she wanted to build that didn't involve erasing him. What had been broken before she took the seat. What she had broken after. Running a company wasn't about strength. It was about balance. And for the first time she finally saw just how uneven the scales had been. Meanwhile, halfway across town, Adrian stepped into a small cafe he used to visit before dawn runs to distant warehouses. The barista recognized him, smiled, and placed a mug on the counter without asking. Rough week, she asked. He chuckled. That obvious? You look like a man who found out his favorite truck has been replaced with a bicycle. He laughed again, soft, genuine. That's surprisingly accurate. He took his coffee to the corner table and opened the folder containing the trust documents. They felt different now. Less like a shield. More like a burden he never asked for but couldn't ignore. He reread the clause about succession stability and thought about what stability actually meant. Not calm. Not silence. Not a perfect org chart crafted by someone who had never carried a pallet. Stability meant this. Two siblings finally telling the truth. Acknowledging their flaws. Accepting their strengths. And understanding that a legacy wasn't passed down. It was built again and again, day after day, by people willing to carry its weight without dropping it on each other's heads. He folded the documents neatly and put them away. Not because he was done with them, but because for the first time he believed he might never need to use them. Not if his sister truly meant what she said. Back at the office, the board caught wind of the tension shift before Nadia even finished her new strategy draft. They noticed the absence of panic. They noticed the steadier tone in her emails. They noticed, though they would never admit it, that decisions landed differently when she wasn't pretending she had all the answers. The chairman scheduled a routine touchpoint with her. Routine for him meant 3 pages of concerns disguised as friendly recommendations. She entered the meeting ready for battle, but instead she found him studying her with unusual curiosity, like someone trying to figure out why a fire stopped spreading. "How are you holding up?" he asked cautiously. "I'm fine," she replied. "Are you?" he pressed. She hesitated. For the first time since stepping into that high-back CEO chair, she told the truth. "I wasn't," she said quietly, "but I'm working on being better." He nodded slowly. "Good. 'Cause we need you steady. The company needs clarity." She steadied herself. "You'll have it. I promise." He studied her posture, the calmness in her voice, the absence of the frantic edge she'd carried since day one. He didn't know what had changed, but he could feel it. "Very well," he said. "Let's talk future." In the warehouse, word spread that the CEO and the former COO were speaking again. The staff didn't gossip loudly. People in logistics are too practical for theatrics, but they exchanged relieved glances. They had seen enough family businesses implode to know that once siblings stop talking, warehouses collapse faster than trust. Drivers noticed the change first. Less tension on the morning calls. Fewer urgent emails with contradictory instructions. A faint but unmistakable sense of alignment. Boyd, the fleet manager, commented to a dispatcher, "Feels like the air pressure's normal again." The dispatcher nodded. "Yeah, like the storm passed." "And did it?" Boyd asked. "Not sure," the dispatcher said. "But the thunder stopped." Nadia and Adrian's first real conversation happened in her office late one evening, long after most people had gone home. She invited him not with a formal meeting request but with a simple text. "I'm here. If you're free." He arrived 10 minutes later, wearing that same quiet expression that always made it hard to guess whether he was amused or simply patient. She gestured to the chair across from her. "I want your help," she said directly. He raised an eyebrow. "With what?" "With everything," she admitted. "The operations I thought I understood but didn't. The relationships I underestimated. The things I broke because I was too focused on being seen." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because I want your help too." She blinked. "Mine? Why?" He leaned back slightly of a man who'd spent years choosing silence over conflict. "Because I may know the heart of the company," he said, "but you know its future. And Dad never intended for one of us to lead without the other. He told me that once. Said the company is too big for one pair of hands and too small to survive a war." She swallowed the tightness in her throat. "He told me something similar," she whispered. "That the chair isn't a crown. It's a yoke." "That sounds like him." Adrian murmured. For the first time they shared a small, tired laugh. A laugh not born of irony or victory, but of relief. Relief that the burden was no longer theirs alone. Relief that apology could be the beginning of something sturdier than ego. Over the next week they worked quietly together. Not in flashy meetings. Not in performative gestures, but in real grounded steps. Adrian walked her through the unspoken rhythms of the warehouse. Nadia walked him through the long-term strategies he'd never had time to digest. They compared notes, challenged each other, laughed at their father's old sayings, filled in gaps the other had left behind. And for the first time, the company began to feel like it was being led by a family, instead of people acting out roles assigned by grief. The board noticed. The staff noticed. Even Vanessa noticed and, to her credit, stepped back gracefully once she saw the sibling dynamic recalibrating itself. But the most important person to notice was Nadia herself. Not her status, not her power, not her title, but her brother. The brother she had pushed aside. The brother she thought she needed to outrank. The brother who held the trust not as a weapon, but as a promise, a safeguard, a seatbelt. And the realization settled over her fully. She didn't need to prove she could lead without him. She needed to prove she could lead with him. By the end of that week, neither of them had expected. The fear was gone. The resentment was gone. The insecurity was gone. There was only a quiet, mutual understanding. The company would survive because the siblings were finally stable. And stability, not control, was what their father had been waiting for all along. Redemption doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, like dawn slipping under a curtain, soft, steady, unhurried. The kind of light you only notice once it fills the whole room. For Nadia, redemption began not with grand gestures, but with a simple shift in how she walked into the office. The stiffness was gone. The invisible armor she'd been wearing since the day she became CEO had cracked, and instead of rebuilding it, she let it fall. People felt the difference before she even spoke. It was in her eyes, in her posture, in the way she listened instead of defended. Her first true test arrived sooner than anyone expected. A shipment for one of their biggest pharmacy clients went missing. Not delayed, missing. A full truckload had been scanned out of the warehouse but never arrived at its destination. Panic rippled through operations. Dispatchers retraced digital footprints. Drivers double-checked logs. The client, polite but simmering, demanded answers. 6 months ago, Nadia would have handled this like a CEO playing a CEO. A polished call. A delicate excuse. A firm assurance she wasn't entirely sure she could keep. This time she didn't sit in her office rehearsing lines. She went downstairs. Into the warehouse. Into the noise. Into the heartbeat of the business her father built. Her heels echoed against the concrete, but no one heard them. Everyone was too focused on the crisis. She walked straight to the operations station where Boyd, the fleet manager, was hunched over a monitor. "What happened?" she asked. He blinked, surprised she'd appeared without anyone escorting her. "We're trying to piece it together," Boyd said. "The truck left the yard on time, but we lost GPS after the highway junction. Could be a glitch. Could be theft. Could be the driver took a wrong turn." "Show me," she said. He hesitated. Not because he doubted her, but because he knew the chaos she was stepping into. Moments later, Adrian arrived. He didn't come storming in. He didn't take over. He simply stepped beside her. "Do you want to walk the route?" he asked. She nodded. Together they studied the map, traced the digital breadcrumbs, examined timestamps and signal drops. Staff watched them, sensing something unusual. Two Caldwells standing shoulder to shoulder, not overlapping, not challenging, just working. An hour passed. Then two. They didn't notice. They were too deep in the rhythm of problem solving. Finally, Adrian spotted something. "There," he said. The GPS didn't glitch. It bounced off a valley dead zone. Drivers know to avoid that road unless they're rerouting around construction. Nadia zoomed in. The valley road. A narrow bypass. Beautiful in the daytime. Treacherous at night. "Who was the driver?" she asked. "M.O., Boyd said. "Good guy. Solid record." "Then if he took the valley road," she murmured, "he must have had a reason." She didn't assume incompetence. She assumed humanity. That alone stunned the staff. Adrian's jaw tightened. We need to send a search team. Nadia made the call instantly. No ego. No hesitation. Cars were dispatched. The security team was mobilized. Local police were notified. 2 hours later they found the truck, off the valley road, half slid into a ditch. The cargo was intact. So was Mo, just shaken, bruised, and embarrassed. It was the detour, Mo explained. Traffic was insane. I thought I could save time. Nadia arrived at the scene. Mo's eyes widened. Ma'am, you didn't have to come. She put a hand on his arm. You're part of this company, she said. Of course I did. Mo blinked back emotion. He'd never been addressed by a CEO before, not like that. Not as a person. Not as someone who mattered. The shipment was retrieved. The client was informed honestly, no excuses, no flattery. They were impressed with the transparency and speed, and that night, in the quiet of her office, Nadia finally understood something she had been resisting for years. Leadership is not height. Leadership is reach. How far you're willing to reach into the real world, the chaos, the discomfort, the places where things bend the rules of convenience. Adrian joined her in the office doorway. You handled that well, he said. She looked up, startled by the sincerity. I just did what needed doing. He stepped inside, set a file on her desk. What's this? She asked. Driver training program. The one I proposed years ago but never had the bandwidth to expand. She opened it. Detailed notes. Safety procedures. Route alternatives. Emergency protocols. Driver-to-management communication plans. You should lead this, he said. It needs the CEO's authority. She looked at him, really looked at him. Not as someone she once competed with. Not as a reminder of her insecurities. Not as the shadow she feared. But as her equal. I'd rather we lead it together, she said. He smiled, a quiet smile filled with relief and a little disbelief. Yeah, I'd like that. In the weeks that followed, something rare happened. Not drama. Not corporate chaos. Not power games. Harmony. Not perfect harmony, real harmony. The kind that still contained disagreements, still sparked debates, still required patience, like two sides of a compass, one pointing toward the future, the other grounding them in the map. Meetings went smoother. Operations stabilized. Morale rose. For the first time since their father's passing, Caldwell and daughters didn't feel like a fracture held together by duct tape. Felt like a family business again. A real one. Not the kind in brochures. The kind built on flawed people who choose to stay. One evening, after a long day of planning, Nadia found herself alone in the conference room. The city lights reflected off the polished table, their father's portrait hung on the far wall, watching over them in that quiet, amused way old photographs often do. She stood there for a long time. I get it now, she whispered toward the portrait. Why you chose both of us. Why you wrote the clause. Why you trusted us with each other, even when we didn't trust ourselves. Her eyes softened. I'm not you, she said. And neither is Adrian. But together we're close. Across the building, Adrian packed his things for the night, glancing at the trust folder sitting on his shelf. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. For the first time since it activated, he believed he would one day be able to shut it, lock it, and never open it again. Not because power had been restored, but because stability had. Some endings don't arrive with applause. They arrive in the quiet shift of air when something that was once broken finds its way back into alignment. And as the weeks passed, the Caldwell siblings began to see their father's old company not as an inheritance to be fought over, but as a living thing, one that responded to peace the same way a wound responds to clean hands. The warehouse felt different. Lighter. Warmer. People smiled more. Not the forced corporate versions, the real ones. The kind that appear when leadership stops feeling like a storm hovering above everyone's heads. The board felt the shift too. Meetings grew less brittle. Directors stopped bracing themselves for conflict. Even the consultant who once believed streamlined leadership meant a single head, watched the siblings with cautious admiration. She didn't retract her slides, but she softened her certainty. Transformation didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in dozens of small ones, like when Nadia walked into the driver break room, unannounced, to thank them for the work they did during the route crisis. She brought coffee, strong, cheap. exactly the way drivers liked it, and listened as they talked about engine noise and road conditions and shortcuts she never knew existed. Or when Adrian sat beside her in a strategy call, not as the operations oracle everyone depended on, but as a quiet reinforcement, letting her lead without propping her up or stepping into her shadow. Or when Boyd, the fleet manager, said under his breath, "Feels like the Caldwells are finally driving the same truck." And nobody disagreed. Slowly, trust seeped back into corners it had abandoned long ago. But the true turning point arrived at the quarterly all-staff meeting, a tradition their father started decades ago. Every department crowded into the warehouse's central bay, the forklifts parked neatly in a semicircle like an audience waiting for truth. This time Nadia stood on the small platform alone. No consultant at her side. No slide deck behind her. Just her voice. She greeted the staff, spoke about updates, talked through new safety procedures and operational improvements. She thanked teams by name. Her sincerity was unmistakable. Then she paused. "There's something I need to address," she said, her voice carrying through the cavernous space. "Something I haven't talked about publicly." The warehouse grew still. She glanced toward Adrian, who leaned casually against a stack of pallets, arms crossed, expression unreadable but supportive in the way only siblings can decode. "When I became CEO," she continued, "I thought leadership meant independence. I thought proving myself meant standing alone. And trying to do that, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The staff listened in stunned silence. Adrian looked down for a moment, then met her gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, only understanding. "I removed my brother from his role," she said. "Not because he failed, but because I was afraid of failing next to him." A few people shifted awkwardly. Others held their breath. "And I was wrong," she said simply. "I was wrong about leadership. Wrong about what this company needed. Wrong about what my father built." She placed a hand on the podium, grounding herself. "This company is not a ladder," she said. "It's a legacy. And legacies aren't carried by one person. They're carried by all of us." Her voice softened. "And the truth is, Adrian never stopped carrying it. Even when I pushed him out." A murmur rippled through the room, surprise, respect, and something deeper, relief. She turned toward him. "Adrian, thank you for staying. Thank you for protecting this company, even when I didn't protect you." He pushed off the pallets and walked toward the platform, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but naturally, like someone stepping into the place where he'd always belonged. When he reached her side, the staff erupted into applause, not because they were witnessing a public reconciliation, but because they were witnessing balance return to a place that had been off-kilter for too long. Nadia stepped aside, offering him the microphone. He didn't take it. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture so simple, so steady, that the entire warehouse exhaled. "She's your CEO," he said. "And she's ready." It wasn't a speech. It was a declaration. A transfer of confidence more powerful than any clause or vote or org chart. And just like that, the tension that had saturated the air for months evaporated. Drivers whistled. Someone shouted, "About time," and the entire warehouse laughed. The legacy had finally settled. Not into one set of hands, but into two. Later that night, after the crowd dispersed and the forklifts returned to their quiet vigil, the siblings stood alone in the center of the warehouse, their father's universe, their childhood playground, the cathedral of their family's history. "You didn't have to say all that," Adrian said softly. "Yes," she replied, "I did." He looked around the empty bay. "Dad would have liked today." She smiled. "He probably would have cried." Adrian snorted. He would have said the air was too dusty. They both laughed, the sound echoing through the vast space like a rediscovered language. "About the trust," Nadia began. He held up a hand. "Don't apologize again. It's staying with me until succession stabilizes. Dad wanted it that way." "But succession is stable," she said. "Not yet," he replied. "Stability isn't a moment. It's consistency. But you're getting there. And when it's time, I'll hand it back." She exhaled, the tension finally releasing from her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "It's what family does." And in that quiet moment between two siblings standing beneath the steel rafters of their inheritance, the entire story, The conflict, the firing, the claws, the fear, the reconciliation, settled into its true shape. Not a fight for power, but a fight to grow. Some stories end with crowns. This one ends with clarity. A sister who learned that leadership isn't about standing alone. A brother who learned that strength doesn't require the spotlight. A company that rediscovered the heart its founder left behind. In the warehouse late one night, long after the lights dimmed and the trucks rolled into sleep, the siblings stood by their father's portrait, the one that looked over them with a smile too subtle for strangers to notice. "I get it now," whispered, and the air answered with a stillness so full it felt like approval. In the end, the company didn't belong to one of them. It belonged to both. To the balance they found. To the truth they chose. To the laughter that returned. Because real legacies aren't built in boardrooms. They're built in the quiet forgiveness of siblings who refuse to let pride become their inheritance. And sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones we win alone, but the ones we learn to share.